At 0130 on March 2, 1945, First Lieutenant Hermann Ernst pushed his P-61 Black Widow through absolute darkness over the German border, tracking a radar contact he could not see. 26 years old, 8 months of night combat, the only American night fighter pilot in Europe who had already walked away from a crash that killed everyone else on board. Behind him, his radar operator, Lieutenant Edward Kopsel, watched the green sweep of the SCR-720 radar scope. Kopsel had his own ghost story. He was also the sole survivor of a separate aircraft accident. 2 men who should have been dead, flying together in a plane they had named Borrowed Time. The mathematics of night fighting in 1944 were brutal. American bomber crews flew daylight missions over Germany, protected by swarms of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. But when darkness fell, the Luftwaffe still owned the sky. German night bombers slipped across the English Channel, killing ground crews, destroying fuel depots, and terrorizing rear area troops who thought they were safe. The Army Air Forces had one answer: the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, the first American aircraft designed specifically to hunt and kill in total darkness. But the P-61 had a problem that the official reports never mentioned. The pilots could not see their targets. At all. The Black Widow carried the most advanced airborne radar in the Allied arsenal, the SCR-720, capable of detecting enemy aircraft from 5 miles away. The radar operator sat in a separate compartment behind the pilot, watching his scope, calling out vectors, guiding the pilot toward a blip on a screen. The pilot flew blind, trusting numbers and headings, closing on an enemy he would never see until he was close enough to kill. Most pilots hated it. They had trained to dogfight, to see their opponent, to judge distance and angle with their own eyes. Night fighting stripped all of that away. A pilot could fly for hours in absolute blackness, chasing contacts that turned out to be friendly aircraft, weather anomalies, or nothing at all. And when they did find a real target, they had seconds to identify it before firing. Shoot the wrong plane, and they killed their own men. Hesitate too long, and the target disappeared into the night. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron had arrived in England in March 1944 as the first American P-61 unit in Europe. By the time Ernst and Kopsel joined, the squadron had learned the hard way what night combat demanded. Crews disappeared on training flights. Mechanical failures killed men who never saw combat. The Black Widow was fast, heavily armed, and absolutely unforgiving of mistakes. Ernst understood this better than most. Before the P-61, before the 422nd, he had survived something that should have ended his flying career permanently. The details stayed with him every time he climbed into the cockpit. Kopsel carried his own memories. 2 men marked by crashes that killed their crewmates, now trusting each other with their lives every night over enemy territory. If you want to see how Ernst and Kopsel turned their borrowed time into something the Luftwaffe would fear, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Ernst. The P-61s of the 422nd had been stationed at Florennes, Belgium since September 1944. The airfield was a captured Luftwaffe base, still scarred by Allied bombing. By February 1945, the squadron had scored dozens of kills, but most crews measured success differently. They measured it by coming back. Ernst and Kopsel had been flying together for months. They had developed something rare in night fighting: trust. Kopsel called the vectors. Ernst followed them without question. In total darkness, at 300 miles per hour, there was no room for doubt. On the night of March 1st, 1945, they took off from Florennes on a routine patrol. The weather was marginal. Clouds hung low over the border. Somewhere ahead, German aircraft were crossing into Allied airspace. Ernst climbed to 8,000 feet and waited for Kopsel to find them something to kill. The P-61 Black Widow was unlike anything the Army Air Forces had ever built. 49 feet long, 66-foot wingspan, 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines producing over 2,000 horsepower each. The aircraft weighed over 13 tons fully loaded, making it one of the heaviest fighters of the war. Most pilots who transitioned from single-engine fighters needed weeks to adjust to the Black Widow's size and handling. But size was the price of capability. The P-61 carried four 20mm Hispano cannons mounted in the belly, capable of firing 600 rounds per minute each. Some variants added four 50-caliber machine guns in a dorsal turret. When a Black Widow found its target, the target died. The problem was finding it. The SCR-720 radar filled the entire nose of the aircraft. The system weighed over 400 pounds and required constant attention from a trained operator. The radar sent out pulses of radio energy that bounced off objects in the sky. The returns appeared as blips on a circular scope: range, bearing, altitude. The radar operator translated those blips into numbers, and the numbers became vectors that guided the pilot through the darkness. Ernst had learned to fly before he learned to trust. His path to the P-61 had taken him through basic flight training, advanced single-engine school, and then a transition course that changed everything. Night fighting required a different kind of pilot, one who could surrender control of his eyes and fly on instruments alone, one who could sit in absolute blackness for hours without losing focus, one who could pull a trigger based on nothing but faith in his radar operator. The crash that nearly ended Ernst's career happened before he ever saw combat. Training accidents killed more night fighter crews than the Germans did in the early months. Aircraft systems failed without warning. Pilots became disoriented in darkness and flew into the ground. Navigational errors put crews over hostile territory or left them lost over the ocean. Ernst survived one of these accidents. The others on board did not. Kopsel's story ran parallel. Radar operators faced their own dangers. They sat in a separate compartment at the rear of the gondola, isolated from the pilot and gunner. If something went wrong, they often had no warning. Kopsel had been in an aircraft that went down. He walked away. His crewmates did not. The two men met at the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron and discovered they shared more than a military occupational specialty. They shared the experience of surviving when others died. In a squadron where superstition ran deep, where crews painted lucky symbols on their aircraft and carried talismans into combat, Ernst and Kopsel made a different choice. They named their P-61 Borrowed Time. Not as a joke, as an acknowledgement. They were flying on time that should have belonged to dead men. Their partnership worked because neither man questioned the other. Kopsel did not second-guess Ernst's flying. Ernst did not second-guess Kopsel's radar calls. In night combat, hesitation killed. A contact could appear and disappear in seconds. A pilot who demanded visual confirmation before committing to an attack would lose his target every time. Ernst committed. When Kopsel said turn, Ernst turned. When Kopsel said climb, Ernst climbed. When Kopsel said the target was 500 yards ahead, Ernst armed his cannons and prepared to fire at empty darkness. By July 1944, the 422nd was operational over the English Channel. The Germans had launched their V-1 campaign against England, sending pilotless flying bombs across the water at 350 miles per hour. The V-1s flew low and fast, difficult targets for conventional fighters, but the P-61's radar could track them in any weather, at any hour. On the night of July 16th, Ernst and Kopsel received a vector to intercept an inbound V-1. Ernst pushed the throttles forward and dove from 5,000 feet, following Kopsel's directions. The radar showed the target clearly. Range closing, 500 yards. 400. 300. Ernst could see nothing. Then a flicker of orange exhaust appeared in the blackness ahead. The V-1's pulse jet engine, burning fuel as it carried a 1-ton warhead toward London. Ernst squeezed the trigger. The four 20mm cannons roared. The V-1 exploded in a fireball that lit the channel for miles. The first P-61 kill in the European theater. Ernst and Kopsel had proven what borrowed time could do. But flying bombs were not fighters. The real test was still coming. The war in Europe changed on June 6, 1944. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, and within weeks, the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron moved from England to France. The new base at Maupertuis sat on the Cherbourg Peninsula, close enough to the front lines that crews could hear artillery rumbling in the distance. Night fighting over France was different from hunting V-1s over the Channel. The flying bombs followed predictable trajectories. They did not maneuver, they did not shoot back. German pilots did both. The Luftwaffe had shifted tactics after D-Day. Daylight operations over France meant certain death with Allied fighters controlling the skies. But at night, German bombers and intruders still slipped through. They attacked supply convoys, bombed airfields, and strafed troop columns moving toward the front. The 422nd existed to stop them. Ernst and Kopsel flew their first combat mission against piloted aircraft in mid-August. The ground-controlled intercept station, call sign Nuthouse, vectored them toward a contact moving west at 8,000 feet. Kopsel picked up the target on radar at 4 miles. Ernst turned to intercept. The problem with night interception was identification. Regulations required positive visual identification before firing. The sky over France was filled with Allied aircraft. Bombers returning from missions, transport planes hauling supplies, fighters on patrol. Shooting down a friendly aircraft meant court-martial and the deaths of men on your own side. But German aircraft looked similar to Allied types at night. A twin-engine silhouette could be a Junkers Ju-88 or a British Mosquito. A single-engine contact could be a Focke-Wulf or a P-47. Ernst closed to 600 yards. Kopsel called the range. 500. 400. Ernst still saw nothing but blackness. Then a shape materialized against a slightly lighter horizon. Twin engines, twin tails. The silhouette matched nothing in the Allied inventory. Ernst fired a 2-second burst. The 20mm shells tore into the target's left engine. The aircraft rolled, trailing fire, and dove toward the ground. Ernst followed it down, watching until it exploded in a French field. The debrief confirmed the kill. A Heinkel HE-111, probably returning from a nuisance raid on Allied positions. Ernst and Kopsel had their first manned aircraft victory. But one kill did not make an ace, and the 422nd was learning that success in night fighting required more than skill. It required luck. It required an enemy who cooperated by flying into your patrol sector, and it required an aircraft that worked. The P-61 was mechanically complex. The twin engines demanded constant maintenance. The radar systems failed unpredictably. Hydraulic lines leaked. Electrical systems shorted. By the time the squadron moved to Florennes, Belgium in September, Ernst had logged dozens of sorties. Most ended without contact. The ones that found targets often ended in frustration when equipment failed at the critical moment. Other crews in the squadron were having similar experiences. The 422nd scored kills, but the pace was agonizingly slow. German aircraft appeared in small numbers, widely scattered across the front. Finding them was like hunting individual fish in a dark ocean. Then December came, and everything changed. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched Operation Watch on the Rhine. 200,000 troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft struck through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the offensive. For the first time in months, German aircraft filled the night skies over Belgium. The 422nd suddenly had more targets than they could handle. But the squadron had a problem. Maintenance issues and combat losses had reduced their operational aircraft to a handful. On some nights, only 4 P-61s were flyable. 4 aircraft to defend the entire sector against a German air force desperate to support its ground offensive. Ernst and Kopsel were about to discover what borrowed time could really do. The Battle of the Bulge tested every Allied unit in Belgium. For the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, the test came in forms that no training had prepared them for. The weather turned brutal in late December. Snow blanketed Florennes airfield. Temperatures dropped below zero. Ground crews worked with numb fingers to keep aircraft operational, draining oil from engines overnight to prevent freezing, covering canopies with tarps to keep ice from forming. The P-61 had not been designed for these conditions. Neither had the men who flew and maintained it. But the Germans kept coming. Luftwaffe bombers struck Allied positions every night, supporting the ground offensive that had punched a massive bulge into American lines. German night intruders attacked supply routes. Transport aircraft dropped paratroopers behind Allied positions. The sky over Belgium had become a battlefield. On the night of December 26th, the 422nd launched every aircraft they could get into the air. Ground-controlled intercept stations tracked multiple German contacts crossing the lines. Ernst and Kopsel were airborne by midnight. climbing through broken clouds toward their patrol sector. The radar scope showed activity everywhere. Kopsel sorted through the contacts, identifying tracks, estimating headings. Most were too far away or moving in the wrong direction. Then he found one. A single aircraft, heading west at 6,000 feet, 30 miles northeast of Florence. Ernst turned to intercept. The P-61 closed the distance at nearly 5 miles per minute. Kopsel called the range. 4 miles. 3. 2. The contact held steady, unaware of the Black Widow dropping in behind it. At 800 yards, Ernst caught a glimpse of exhaust flame. The target was burning navigation lights, a mistake that German pilots sometimes made when they thought they were safely over their own territory. The silhouette resolved into a Junkers Ju-88, a twin-engine bomber that had been killing Allied troops since 1939. Ernst fired. The Ju-88 staggered under the impact of 20mm shells, rolled inverted, and dove into the clouds. Ernst followed it down until Kopsel confirmed the explosion on the ground. That same night, other 422nd crews scored 4 additional victories. 5 German aircraft destroyed in a single night, more than the squadron sometimes claimed in an entire month. The Battle of the Bulge had given them what months of routine patrols could not: targets. But the intensive operations came at a cost. Aircraft broke down faster than crews could repair them. Pilots flew back-to-back missions, landing at dawn only to take off again the next evening. Exhaustion accumulated. Mistakes crept in. One crew was shot down by friendly anti-aircraft fire. Another crashed on landing after hydraulic failure. By mid-January, the German offensive had stalled. Allied counterattacks pushed the Bulge back toward the German border. The Luftwaffe, running short of fuel and pilots, reduced its night operations. For the 422nd, the sudden abundance of targets dried up almost overnight. January and February brought long, empty patrols. Ernst and Kopsel flew mission after mission, returning without contacts. The radar scope showed nothing but weather and friendly aircraft. The Germans had learned to avoid the sectors where American night fighters patrolled. When they did fly, they stayed low, hugging the terrain where radar had difficulty tracking them. The squadron's kill count stalled. Weeks passed without a single victory. Pilots who had tasted success during the Bulge grew frustrated with the return to hunting ghosts. Then March arrived, and with it, a change in German tactics. Allied intelligence reported increased Luftwaffe activity along the Rhine. The Germans were repositioning aircraft, preparing for something. Night reconnaissance flights detected unusual movements at airfields deep in Germany. On the evening of March 1st, Ernst and Kopsel received orders for a patrol over the German border. Nuthouse reported multiple unidentified contacts in their sector. Something was happening. After 2 months of empty skies, the targets were coming back. Ernst climbed borrowed time into the darkness. He had no way of knowing that the next 8 hours would make him and Kopsel the highest-scoring American night fighter crew in Europe. The night of March 1st began like dozens of others. Ernst and Kopsel lifted off from Florence at 2200 hours, climbing through scattered clouds toward their assigned patrol sector east of Liège. The weather was marginal, but flyable. Broken overcast at 8,000 feet, visibility beneath the clouds around 5 miles. Good enough for hunting. Kopsel powered up the SCR-720 and began scanning. The radar swept the darkness ahead, painting returns on the scope. Most were ground clutter, the confused echoes from terrain features that made low-altitude tracking difficult. But somewhere in that electronic noise, German aircraft were moving. The first hour passed without contact. Ernst flew a racetrack pattern at 7,000 feet, waiting for Nuthouse to vector them toward a target. The ground-controlled intercept station had larger, more powerful radar than the P-61 carried. They could see aircraft from 50 miles away, tracking movements across the entire sector. When they found something worth chasing, they would call. At 23:15, Nuthouse reported a contact. Single aircraft heading west at 4,000 feet, approximately 20 miles northeast of their position. Ernst turned to intercept. The chase lasted 12 minutes. Kopsel tracked the contact on radar, calling corrections as Ernst maneuvered for position. The range closed steadily. 8 miles, 6, 4. Then the contact dove toward the deck and disappeared into ground clutter. Ernst descended, searching, but the German pilot had escaped into the terrain, masking that radar could not penetrate. They climbed back to altitude and resumed patrol. 15 minutes later, Nuthouse called another vector. This contact was faster, heading southwest at high speed. Ernst pushed the throttles to maximum power and gave chase. The P-61 could reach nearly 370 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to catch most German aircraft. But this target stayed ahead of them, gradually pulling away until it crossed into another sector and Nuthouse handed it off to a different unit. 2 chases, 0 results. The frustration was familiar. Then the anti-aircraft guns found them. Allied gunners were nervous in early 1945. German aircraft had attacked rear areas throughout the winter. Trigger fingers stayed tight. Any aircraft flying at night over the front lines risked being engaged by friendly fire, regardless of identification friend or foe transponders. Ernst saw the tracers rising from below before he heard Kopsel's warning. Orange lines of 40mm fire arced through the darkness, searching for borrowed time's silhouette. Ernst rolled hard, diving away from the barrage. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage. The P-61 shuddered, but kept flying. Damage report from Kopsel. Minor hits, nothing critical. But the flak had driven them off their patrol line and into a gap between sectors. Ernst decided to use it. He flew east, toward German territory, where the Allied gunners could not reach. If the Luftwaffe was flying tonight, they would have to cross this airspace eventually. The gamble paid off 40 minutes later. Nuthouse called at 0110 on March 2nd. Their radar showed multiple contacts near the German border. The station was flooded with tracks, more activity than they had seen in weeks. Something was happening. The Luftwaffe was flying in strength. Nuthouse assigned Ernst and Kopsel a target. Single aircraft, heading west at 6,000 feet, 12 miles east of their position. Ernst turned to intercept. Kopsel locked the radar. This time, the contact did not run. The German pilot held his course, unaware of the Black Widow dropping in behind him. Range closed. 2 miles. 1 mile. 800 yards. Ernst strained to see through the darkness. At 500 yards, the exhaust flames appeared. Twin engines, mounted on a long fuselage with a distinctive twin-boom tail. Kopsel recognized the shape immediately from recognition training. Messerschmitt Bf-110. A German night fighter, probably hunting the same airspace Ernst and Kopsel were defending. Hunter had become prey. Ernst closed to 400 yards. The Messerschmitt Bf-110 flew straight and level, its crew scanning the darkness ahead for Allied bombers. They never looked behind. German night fighters relied on ground radar to warn them of threats. On this night, that warning never came. Ernst aligned his gun sight with the Bf-110 center fuselage and squeezed the trigger. The 4 20mm cannons fired in unison, sending a stream of high-explosive shells into the German aircraft. Pieces flew off the fuselage. The left engine erupted in flame. The Bf-110 rolled hard, diving toward the clouds below. Ernst followed, firing short bursts as the German pilot twisted and turned, trying to shake the Black Widow. The Messerschmitt was fast and maneuverable, flown by a crew that understood night combat. But Ernst had the advantage of position and firepower. At 3,000 feet, the Bf-110 disappeared into the cloud layer. Ernst dove after it, Kopsel calling altitude as the P-61 plunged through the gray murk. They broke out beneath the clouds at 1,500 feet. The German aircraft was gone. Kopsel searched with the radar. Nothing. The Bf-110 had either escaped into the terrain clutter or crashed somewhere in the darkness below. Without visual confirmation of destruction, the kill would be recorded as a probable. Ernst pulled up and climbed back toward patrol altitude. The encounter had lasted less than 3 minutes, but the night was far from over. At 0150, Nuthouse vectored them toward a new contact. This one was different. Slow. Heading west at barely 150 miles per hour. The airspeed suggested a transport aircraft or possibly a bomber flying at reduced power to conserve fuel. Ernst intercepted from above and behind. Kopsel tracked the target through descent, calling corrections as Ernst positioned for the shot. At 600 yards, the shape materialized against the darker ground below. It was not a bomber. The silhouette showed a single engine, fixed landing gear, and the distinctive inverted gull wings of a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. The dive bomber that had terrorized Europe in 1940 was still flying combat missions in 1945, though now only at night, when Allied fighters could not catch it. This Stuka would not escape. Ernst fired from 500 yards. The 20mm shells ripped through the Ju-87's fuselage, The aircraft exploded instantly, the detonation suggesting that it had been carrying bombs. Burning wreckage spiraled toward the ground. Kopsel logged the time, 02:05, confirmed kill. Ernst had barely begun his turn back to patrol altitude when Kopsel reported another contact. Same profile, slow, heading west, less than 4 miles ahead. A second Stuka. The German pilot must have seen his wingman explode. He dove for the deck, pushing his aircraft toward the terrain where radar tracking became unreliable. Ernst followed, descending through 2,000 feet, 1,500, 1,000. The altimeter unwound with terrifying speed. Kopsel never lost the contact. His voice remained steady, calling range and bearing as Ernst closed the distance in a shallow dive. At 400 yards, the Stuka filled the windscreen. Ernst fired. The burst caught the Ju-87 in the engine compartment. The aircraft shed pieces, rolled onto its back, and dove straight into the ground. The explosion lit up the farmland below. 02:12, second confirmed kill in 7 minutes. Ernst climbed back to altitude, breathing hard. His hands ached from gripping the control yoke. 3 engagements in 1 hour, 1 probable, 2 confirmed. Added to their earlier victories, Ernst and Kopsel had just become the first American night fighter crew in Europe to achieve ace status in a single aircraft. But borrowed time was not done yet. Ernst and Kopsel landed at Florennes as dawn broke over Belgium. The ground crew counted the holes in borrowed time's fuselage. Flak damage from the earlier encounter with friendly anti-aircraft fire. Nothing that would ground the aircraft for more than a day. The debriefing took 3 hours. Intelligence officers documented every engagement, every vector, every round fired. The Bf-110 was recorded as damaged, possibly destroyed. The 2 Ju-87s were confirmed kills based on observed explosions. In a single night, Ernst and Kopsel had doubled their total score. Their combined record now stood at 5 confirmed aircraft destroyed, plus 1 V-1 flying bomb. 6 total victories. The number that defined an ace in the American system applied to the entire crew, not just the pilot. Ernst and Kopsel had achieved it together, their names permanently linked in squadron records. But the significance of March 1st and 2nd extended beyond personal achievement. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron compiled the statistics after the war. Ernst and Kopsel's final tally of 5 aircraft and 1 V-1 was unexcelled by any American night fighter crew in the European theater. Other crews matched individual elements of their record. None surpassed the combination of kills, consistency, and survival. The 422nd itself had become the top-scoring American night fighter squadron of the war. 43 confirmed victories over manned aircraft, 5 V-1 flying bombs destroyed. These numbers came at a cost measured in crashed aircraft, mechanical failures, and crews who never returned from patrol. But the squadron had proven that American night fighters could compete with the Luftwaffe in the darkness that German pilots had once owned. 3 crews from the 422nd achieved ace status during the war. Ernst and Kopsel in Borrowed Time, Paul Smith and Robert Tierney in Lady Jen, Eugene Axtell and his radar operator in Battle Axe. Each crew developed their own methods, their own rhythms of communication and trust. What they shared was the ability to function as a single unit in conditions that demanded absolute coordination. The spring of 1945 brought the end of meaningful air combat over Europe. Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March. German industry collapsed under continuous bombing. The Luftwaffe ran out of fuel, pilots, and aircraft. Night missions became long, empty patrols over a dying enemy. Ernst and Kopsel continued flying until the German surrender in May. They never added to their score after the March mission. There was nothing left to hunt. The war they had trained for, the enemy they had learned to find in absolute darkness, simply ceased to exist. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron was inactivated in September 1945. The P-61 Black Widows were flown to depots, stripped of classified equipment, and scrapped. Within a few years, almost nothing remained of the aircraft that had pioneered American night fighting. Ernst's post-war path took a different direction than most combat pilots. He remained in aviation, transitioning to the reserve forces while building a civilian career in sound and communications technology. The skills he had developed flying on instruments, trusting equipment he could not see, translated into a different kind of technical work. Kopsel returned to civilian life as well. The partnership that had made them aces dissolved into peacetime routines. Two men who had trusted each other with their lives in absolute darkness went their separate ways. But the name they had chosen for their aircraft followed them. Borrowed Time had been more than dark humor or superstition. It had been a statement about how they understood their own survival. What that borrowed time ultimately meant would only become clear decades later. Hermann Ernst lived for another 6 decades after the war ended. He retired from the Tennessee Air National Guard as a lieutenant colonel, having served his country in uniform for longer than most Americans knew the P-61 had ever existed. His civilian career in sound and communications technology kept him connected to the technical world that had defined night fighting. He remained an active pilot into his later years, still flying when most men his age had long since stopped. The gathering of Eagles Foundation inducted Ernst into their Hall of Honor, recognizing his achievements alongside other distinguished aviators. The citation mentioned the statistics: 5 aircraft and 1 V-1 destroyed, ace status, top-scoring American night fighter crew in Europe. But statistics could not capture what Ernst and Kopsel had actually done. They had learned to fight blind. They had developed a partnership built on absolute trust in conditions that destroyed lesser crews. They had named their aircraft after the death that should have claimed them both, and then flown that borrowed time into history. Edward Kopsel's post-war life left fewer traces in the official record. Radar operators rarely received the recognition given to pilots, despite sharing equal danger and requiring equal skill. Kopsel had guided Ernst through every intercept, every engagement, every kill. Without his voice in the darkness, calling vectors and ranges, Ernst would have been just another pilot flying empty patrols over Europe. The partnership they formed represented something the Army Air Forces had struggled to create throughout the war. Night fighting demanded a different kind of combat teamwork, not the formation flying of bomber crews or the wingman tactics of day fighters. Something more intimate. 2 men sealed in separate compartments, connected only by intercom, trusting each other completely while hunting enemies they could not see. The P-61 Black Widow that made this partnership possible has nearly vanished from history. Of the 742 aircraft built, only 4 complete airframes survive today. The National Air and Space Museum holds one. The Beijing Aviation Museum has another, captured from nationalist Chinese forces after the war. 2 more exist in various states of restoration. Borrowed Time itself did not survive. Like most combat aircraft, it was scrapped after the war, reduced to aluminum ingots that became refrigerators and automobile parts. The name painted on its nose, the acknowledgement of 2 men's impossible luck, exists now only in photographs and official records. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron has a memorial at the United States Air Force Academy, honoring the crews who pioneered American night fighting in Europe. The unit itself was reactivated decades later, transformed into a test and evaluation squadron at Nellis Air Force Base. Modern pilots flying modern aircraft carry the lineage of men who hunted in absolute darkness with radar scopes and 20mm cannons. What Ernst and Kopsel proved in the skies over Belgium and Germany still matters. They demonstrated that technology could extend human capability into environments where human senses failed. That trust between crew members could substitute for visibility. That men who should have died could choose to fly again, naming their borrowed time and making it count. The night sky over Europe is quiet now. The airfields at Florens and Maupertus serve different purposes. The war that created the need for night fighters ended 80 years ago, but somewhere in the archives, the records survive. Patrol reports, debriefing transcripts, victory credits. The paper trail of 2 men who flew into darkness and came back with kills that no one ever saw. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about radar operators and pilots who hunted blind with nothing but trust and borrowed time. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Herman Ernst and Edward Kopsel do not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.